Hello, welcome to Faculty Voices. Today we have with us Adriana Umaña-Taylor, the Sara Lawrence-Lightfoot Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her work seeks to apply developmental science to help reduce ethnic racial disparities in psychological and academic adjustment, and in turn, promotes social justice. Welcome, Adriana.
Thank you so much, June. Great to be with you.
I've read a bit of your work before starting to prepare for this podcast. And in your work, you talk a lot about ethno-marginalization. Could you please explain to us what that is? It seems to be central to your work.
Yeah, absolutely. The construct or the term that I tend to use is ethno-racial marginalization, and sometimes I use ethnic-racial marginalization. I really started using that term really to make sure that I was capturing and including the experiences of Latinos in the context of the US, particularly because the way that the US Census defines race and ethnicity, oftentimes when we're talking about racial marginalization, the experiences of Latinos are left out. Yet, depending on the socio-political needs of the moment, we actually see that what happens in practice is that Latinos are treated as an ethnicity made up of people from different races, or they're treated as a racial group that's considered a monolith, stereotyped, and treated as other. And so there are some real significant consequences of that social reality, right? Which is what I've been particularly concerned about and interested in throughout my career. And it's that racialized othering, which impacts how our young people see themselves, how they develop an understanding of who they are, who they can become, what they can and they should aspire to, and ultimately all of the messages that young people are receiving about whether or not they belong. And so when I use that term ethno-racial or ethnic racial, I'm really trying to capture that experience of racialization that happens in the context of the United States with respect to not just racial groups as they are defined by the US Census.
I'm wondering also what you mean by marginalization.
Sure. Really in terms of the experiences of marginalization or minoritized status based on race, so anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and really thinking about how people who are racially white and European descent tend to have certain privileges or opportunities, access to power, access to resources. And so that's where that marginalization comes about. And we see this in our political system. We see this in our education system. And so when I use the term ethno-racial marginalization, what I'm really trying to capture and what I'm really trying to get us to think about is that we do live in a society where it historically has been characterized by a socially constructed ethno-racial hierarchy. There is a hierarchical structure of power and access to resources. This structure is grounded in anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and white supremacy. And that has significant consequences for political power, material resources.
What drew you to the subject of marginalization?
So, when I first started graduate school, I was working in a lab and studying dating relationships. And at the time, I was learning all about close relationships and what factors predicted whether or not individuals would be committed to marrying their dating partners. And as I got more into this literature and was being exposed to the existing theories and empirical work in that area, one of the things that I noticed was that the things that I personally thought would be really important to predicting whether or not you were going to marry your dating partner were actually not reflected in the literature. The literature really reflected the experiences more from a white middle class perspective. And it was really all about individual characteristics. How much do you love your partner and how much do you trust your partner? Those were the things that were most important to predicting commitment to wed or commitment to marriage. And so as I was talking more and more with my advisor about this, I really started to put these ideas together about why I was so confused about what the literature was saying and what to me seemed a little bit more instinctive about what should predict your commitment to marrying your partner. And the factors that I was really focused on tended to be much more focused on family. I thought that it was really interesting that in all this literature, there wasn't an emphasis on your family informing your prediction, how much you were going to be committed to marrying your dating partner. So my advisor at the time suggested, well, maybe these are cultural differences that you might be tapping into. And so why don't you look and see, like, what are the factors that predict commitment to marriage for white young adults versus young adults from Latino backgrounds? And so that's how I started not being interested in marginalization, but really interested in identity and really thinking about how does race and ethnicity and culture play a role in the ways in which we are making decisions and thinking about our lives and thinking about the things that should be informing our lives. And so I ended up conducting my master's thesis on that very topic. And what I really found through that process was that I was really interested in the process of identity formation and really thinking about how do young people develop an understanding of who they are with respect to race and ethnicity, because it wasn't about being from a Latino background that made family important. It was really those values and those ideals that were informing that socialization process and ultimately informing different beliefs or ideas that you had when you were making big decisions about your life, particularly with respect to a partner. So as I started to think more and more about identity and really started to learn more about identity development, I really started to think about and understand society a little bit better. And really, at the time, I was in my early 20s, and having grown up in the context of the United States, I had particular experiences as a Latina child of immigrant parents from Colombia. I had my own experiences of growing up as a member of a particular ethnic racial group in the context of the US. And I also had unique experiences having grown up with this particular social identity in the context of Texas, where there's a very particular Latino population. And the majority of Latinos at the time that I was growing up, and I think still currently, were of Mexican origin. And so in a sense, I was sort of a double minority within that context because I was, part of an ethnic minority, pan-ethnic group. But then within that larger pan-ethnic group of Latinos or Hispanics, which was the common terminology in Texas, I was, sort of another minority because the largest population was of Mexican origin. So I think all of those experiences, those personal experiences growing up, certainly played a role in my interest in social identities and particularly race and ethnicity, and particularly context. Although I focus on identity development and adolescent, ethnic and racial identity development, I'm always thinking about the social context and how is it that the more immediate social settings, so whether it's the family, the school, the community, how those factors play a role in the identity that's developing among young people, but then also really the macro context as well. So what is going on in the country that this development is taking place, and really what's happening more globally. And so you see that sort of as a thread that runs throughout my work, and that's not a coincidence. That's very much due to my own experiences when I was growing up and forming a sense and understanding of who I was.
Did you feel marginalized?
I think that I absolutely had experiences of marginalization when I was growing up, and absolutely, no question. Did I know that that's what that was at that time? Did I have the concepts and constructs and ideas? Absolutely not. In fact, I think that that is one of the things that has really informed my interest in pursuing this with respect to understanding young people, is that I didn't have that understanding when I was growing up. I was just developing a sense of who I was, and I didn't realize that it was based in this context, basically.
You're branching out from the United States to work on Latin America. What's different about working there, and why is it important to branch out?
There are many different ways to answer this question, June, which is why I'm sort of hesitating. And that's because there has been an interest in branching out that was personal and that drew me to Colombia and South America specifically. And at the same time that personal interest in branching out was developing, I also had colleagues in other countries reaching out to me to talk with me about how these concepts that I had been advancing and working with here in the context of the United States might actually apply in their particular countries and cultural settings. And so it's been a little bit of a push and a pull. So that's been really interesting. When I was talking earlier in our conversation about this term ethno-racial, it really has branched out even more as I've been working with colleagues in other countries, because as I mentioned in my answer, when I was thinking about ethno-racial and how I'm really thinking about in the context of the United States, as I work with colleagues in other countries, what I've noticed and what I've seen is that this racialization that I'm trying to capture with this broader term happens in other countries based similarly on ethnicity or on religion or indigeneity. But my colleagues in other countries or their colleagues in those countries are really hesitant to use the word race, because the word race is seen as so specific to the United States context, when in fact, when we look historically at colonization and what's happened in our country and in other countries, we see some real parallels in the ways in which this racialization and this othering based on social identities has a significant impact on the identities that young people are developing. So I would say that that interest in branching out to other countries has emerged both based on my own personal interests and also just based on interest from colleagues in other countries who want to apply some of these ideas in their particular cultural settings.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time to be working on adolescents. It seems like the pandemic in the United States was especially hard on teenagers. And of course, in Latin America, teenagers had it even harder because most of the time they couldn't even go out because of the strict lockdowns. So, do you think that teens who belong to these marginalized groups had a tougher time in Latin America? And what are some of the challenges that you see there?
So I would say that I don't have the empirical evidence to answer that question. Yet, when I think about the disparities that we've seen in the context of the United States, and when I think about the factors that lead to these experiences of marginalization and their significant consequences, I would say that the pandemic likely has disproportionately affected young people from groups that experience marginalization based on race, ethnicity, and related social identities. I think that it is really important for us to think about the ways in which young people from groups that experience marginalization or at risk for experiences of marginalization, the resources that they have available to them. I think it's important for us to think about what are the structures in place, which then leads me to think, well, absence of the empirical evidence that I'd love to just be able to share with you and say, yes, here's the evidence. Honestly, I have not been. I'm going back to Colombia this summer and going to pick this work back up. I've been, speaking of the pandemic, a little bit distracted from really being able to develop the work that I started there prior to the pandemic. And so I'm excited to go back and to work with my colleagues and advance some of this work that we started on prior to the pandemic. And I hope to have a better answer to this question that you're asking. But my guess would be, yes, just like we've seen those differences here in which the pandemic actually has exacerbated many of the disparities that we see along the lines of race and ethnicity in the context of the US, I would imagine that we're seeing similar implications for young people in Colombia.
One of the things I really loved about reading about your work, Adriana, is that you're not just talking in terms of academic concepts, but in terms of really practical things like the Identity Project, a manualized curriculum. I wonder if you could talk specifically about the Identity Project.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Identity Project was developed as a health promotion prevention program for adolescents. And ultimately, this was an intervention that I developed after years of generative research of really some significant evidence demonstrating that as young people develop an understanding of who they are with respect to race and ethnicity, and they do more to explore this part of their background, and they do more to gain a sense of clarity about what this part of their identity means for their sense of self, we see better adjustment. And this is because young people, as they're growing up and developing in a society where issues of race and ethnicity are particularly relevant and salient, they have questions about who they are with respect to race and ethnicity. And so engaging in that process of exploration and deepening an understanding of who you are in that regard provides young people with a sense of self-assuredness, greater confidence, and understanding about these social concepts, right? So when we developed the Identity Project, my students and I would basically really focused on targeting that developmental process. At the time when I was developing this intervention, when you looked at what existing programs were out there, what curricula were out there that focused on race and ethnicity, the majority of those programs really tended to focus more on the affect or positive feelings or pride that individuals might develop relating to their ethnic or racial group. And the Identity Project was different because it was targeting the developmental process. And it was also different because it really focused on providing young people with strategies and tools and time with which to engage in this exploration process on their own. So the curriculum is not designed to teach adolescents about their background. It's merely designed to provide the time and the space and strategies or tools with which young people can engage in their own process of exploration. And so that's one of the things that makes this curriculum particularly different, is that we're really targeting the identity development process, and we are not teaching young people about their backgrounds. We're giving them the space within which they can do the exploration and do the learning on their own, and really give them a sense of that agency, which is so important during the period of adolescence.
When you talk about strategies and tools, what do you mean?
So with the Identity Project, before we provide any strategies or tools, one of the things we have to really do is help young people even just understand that we're all developing an identity, and that our identities are made up of many different things, right? And in the context of the United States, one of the things that informs our sense of self and our understanding of ourselves is our ethnic racial background, particularly because of the history of our country, and particularly because of the ways you are exposed to issues of race and ethnicity on a daily basis. And so that increases the salience of that particular social identity for young people, for everybody, right, in this particular social context. And so we begin just by providing that basic kind of framework or understanding. And then some of these strategies and tools are, for example, we have young people create an identity backpack where they are exploring and thinking about all of the different things that make them who they are, right? And so they're identifying all of the different aspects of themselves, and then they're sharing that with their peers and talking about those things. After we engage in this activity of an identity backpack, and after we talk about how race and ethnicity is one of these aspects in the identity backpack, we then talk a little bit about what are some of the stereotypes that young people are aware of with respect to their ethnic racial background, stereotypes that they're aware of and that they don't want people to assume of them, but they know that it is a reality that sometimes they're viewed according to these stereotypes given the social context. And so we're not sharing with students what these stereotypes are. We're having them engage in a process of reflection and really thinking about what experiences have they had, what do they see in the media, what do they experience on a regular basis that helps to inform their understanding of race and ethnicity. And so really helping them to have those as tools with which to engage in a deeper reflection, but tied specifically and explicitly to race and ethnicity. So oftentimes what happens when we do address or talk about issues of race or ethnicity, for example, in the school setting, these are issues that are tackled or addressed as something that exists out there. You are talking about it as something that is separate from you, something that you are analyzing and interpreting, but it's not personal. And so what the Identity Project enables young people to do is to understand that these are experiences that they are having or that they have had personally, and that can impact them and impact the way that they view themselves, the way that they view others. I would say that these strategies and tools are really just opportunities for them to engage in self-reflection and also to practice talking about these topics with their peers, because the Identity Project curriculum is designed to be implemented in the school setting, and it's very much designed to be implemented in engagement with their peers. And this was a design element that we very purposefully chose because young people themselves told us that the best way that they had learned about themselves with respect to race and ethnicity was actually by engaging in conversations with their friends and learning more about their friends' backgrounds, having conversations about their backgrounds. And so when we designed the curriculum, we really tried to stay true to the ways in which young people were telling us that had been most powerful for them for learning about themselves.
Does the Identity Project use social media at all to get at these issues?
We do not use social media. We didn't want to make this curriculum something that was not accessible across different groups and across different contexts based on socioeconomic status and access. And so we really tried to develop this curriculum so that it could really be implemented without access to social media. That said, I think that as it's been implemented in different school settings, educators do take the curriculum and modify it to be consistent with what is typical in their classrooms, what are their students engaging with, and in some cases, there are different ways that technology has actually been integrated into the Identity Project curriculum, but the curriculum itself does not actually do that.
Yeah, I'm really curious about your experience with new immigrants as opposed to Latinos who have been born or grown up in the United States, because it seems to me I've had so many of my friends who have immigrated say, oh, in Colombia, I was white And, people saw me as being white, and I thought of myself as being white. But here in the United States, all of a sudden, I'm Latina, I'm different, I'm brown. On the other hand, somebody also in the United States, if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. And in Latin America, there are so many gradations and words for being different shades. So I'm wondering what your experience has been with shifting identities.
Yeah, that's a great question, June. An absolute reality of this work is that race, ethnicity, these concepts and these constructs are so context specific. The words that we use vary very considerably across cultural contexts, and folks who have lived in a different cultural context or setting and have particular experiences of privilege or power or access to resources or marginalization in one setting, and then they move to a different setting that has a different socio-historical context, are privy to that experience, right? On one hand, it's really powerful because it helps you be a better observer because you are seeing the influence of context and how your identity is very much context dependent and your experiences can be context dependent. I think that it can be very unsettling, particularly with the example you gave, right, of having a particular experience of not being considered part of a minoritized group and then moving to a different country, in this example that you gave in the case of the United States, and then all of a sudden you are part of a minoritized group, and along with that comes particular experiences potentially of marginalization, of being stereotyped. You asked the question specifically in terms of the Identity Project and young people. The closest experience that we've had addressing this or really working with this topic is when the Identity Project has been adapted for a classroom of English language learners. And this is where students are brand new to the US context and in the process of learning English, right? In many cases, the teachers in these settings are really trying to understand, okay, so how do I engage our students in this curriculum that's based on race and ethnicity when these students are really coming into this cultural setting and this is new to them, but there's also so much more that is also new and completely foreign to them. I'm thinking about just this last fall where we had a teacher who had an English language learning community that she was adapting the Identity Project for. This curriculum was so powerful for her students because one of the things that she shared was that the students actually felt like they were seen, they were understood, because this was a curriculum all about them and their identity. And they were able to explore all of the different things that made them who they were. And as they were learning about stereotyping and experiences of discrimination, they were actually able to think about their experiences in the cultural context where they were most recently coming from the teacher's perspective. It provided these students with like a much broader sense and understanding because they were thinking about what are the ways in which groups are stereotyped and experience discrimination in that particular cultural context. And then how did that inform my experiences? And then how might that be informing my experiences now? So really the ability to think about stereotyping and experiences of discrimination and marginalization on the basis of social identity across cultural contexts, which is really powerful for these young people because it's not just an experience in the United States. It does happen in other countries, but it takes a little bit of reflection and really thinking about, well, what are the social identities that are marginalized in that particular setting? And then how can I draw an analogy between what's happening here and what I might be experiencing now? The other thing I'd like to say is that it's not easy, right? It's not an easy task for the teacher who's trying to adapt it, but it absolutely is feasible. And from what I've heard from this particular teacher that I'm thinking of right now is that it was so powerful for her students to be seen in that way and to be able to reflect on their experiences in a way that they probably wouldn't have been able to just with the basic regular academic curriculum they would have been working on.
Fascinating. You talk about your experience in Colombia, where you plan to study adolescents' ethno-racial identity within the Colombian context, were met with confusion and, as you put it, well-intended discouragement.
Yeah.
Could you describe that experience for us, and how did it change your mind, and how did it change Colombians' minds?
So I started planning my sabbatical, and I was really wanting to do this in Colombia. I started planning it years in advance. I'm a planner. And as part of that process, I visited several different universities to try to get a sense of where in Colombia should I be. My family is originally from Bogota. And so I thought, well, maybe Bogota is a place to be. And then I had some colleagues who were from Medellin. And so they had suggested, oh, you should check Medellin out. Medellin's really great. I had never been to Medellin. And so I thought, okay, well, let me check out Medellin as well. I visited 3 different universities and had connections in each of the universities and really just spent a day at each university visiting with psychologists there who were potential hosts for my sabbatical. And it was wonderful. I have not had any formal educational experiences in Colombia. So to me, really being able to explore Colombian universities was really exciting. All of my formal education has been in the United States in the context of the US. And so I'd never even done a study abroad anywhere else. So that was really exciting. And they were excited that I was considering a sabbatical at their respective institutions as well. And so our conversations were mutual excitement. And then they would ask me a little bit more about what is it that you're hoping to study when you're here? What is it that you're wanting to understand? And I talked about how I was really interested in exploring concepts of race and ethnicity, and particularly ethnic racial identity development with Colombian adolescents. In every single experience, every single conversation that I had, these colleagues would say, we're so excited that you are planning a sabbatical here, and we're so excited for you to be here, and we hope you choose this university to come and do your sabbatical. And we also just want to suggest that maybe you should think about studying something a little bit different, maybe just adolescent development, maybe some other aspect of adolescent identity, because the issues of race and ethnicity, the way that you've been studying them and what you have been studying in the United States, that just really doesn't exist here. That's not something that really is salient to our young people. It's not something that people talk about. And so I'm just sharing that with you as a friendly suggestion, because we just wouldn't want you to come and not have a fruitful sabbatical, right? And we wouldn't want you to leave the country having studied something that didn't result in something that you could develop later. And so you might really want to think about that, but we're going to support you. And of course, whatever you want to study, we're just going to be so excited to have you here. So it really was from a place, I think, of them wanting to see me have a successful sabbatical and really believing that issues of race and ethnicity were not going to be salient to young people there. And it wasn't going to be something that would necessarily lead to fruitful research results. I would basically just have null findings. So the way that that impacted me was that, first of all, I was pretty confused because I had not grown up in Colombia, but I was raised by Colombian parents, and I had visited Colombia, and I certainly saw similarities between the US and Colombia in terms of the ethnic racial hierarchy. When you look to see who's in power and what is the phenotype, what are the characteristics of people who are in power, who have the political power, who are wealthy, how do those phenotypic characteristics compare to the characteristics of the people who are the housekeepers, who are the people that are the chauffeurs or the drivers or the porteros? What does their background look like? And so to me, it just seemed like, how can issues of race and ethnicity not be relevant? Because I see it as an outsider looking at the ways in which resources and political power are distributed. It seems to me like it's there, it's evident. But being what I like to think of as a good researcher, I also recognize that I'm a complete outsider to this cultural context, and I am not wanting to come in and impose my views on whatever this context is. What I did was I started my research there by conducting focus groups with adolescents from different socioeconomic status groups. And so I did 3 different sets of focus groups with youth from low SES communities, middle SES communities, and high SES communities. And in those focus group discussions, if I said the word race, what would that mean to them? If I said ethnicity, what would that mean? If I said discrimination or being treated badly because of your race, did they understand that? And what would that conversation be like? And so those focus groups then really supported this idea that young people were aware of racial inequities in the country. And this was something worth exploring with young people. So then I conducted 24 individual interviews with adolescents. And again, I stratified the groups by socioeconomic status, because socioeconomic status and social class is such a strong marker in Colombia and South America. So stratified according to that, and also by gender. And I tried to get adolescents who were 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and trying to understand from these individual interviews, because I thought, well, maybe with these focus groups, I was only hearing from certain people, and maybe if I did individual interviews, I would get a different perspective. I conducted these individual interviews, and sure enough, it was very clear to me that these adolescents clearly saw issues of race and ethnicity in Colombia, in their society. They saw it in their schools, they saw it in their neighborhoods, they saw it in the media, and they saw it in the country more generally. And they wanted to talk about it, and they thought it would be important to talk about it, but they weren't talking about it in school. It wasn't something that was talked about. So those interviews were really informative. And then once I had that data from those individual interviews, I then conducted a large-scale survey of almost 500 adolescents across 6 different school settings, again, stratified by socioeconomic status so that I could capture the different experiences. And then those data, again, helped us have a little bit of a different picture of the extent to which young people are aware of issues of race and ethnicity in their particular context, their own personal experiences with ethnic racial discrimination. One of the things that is interesting is that we asked adolescents about how they self-identify with respect to race and ethnicity, and we provided a whole list of all the different ways that you could identify. And it was just really interesting to see what labels would these Colombian adolescents choose, because the adults that I had been chatting with prior, those conversations would have led me to believe that I would have had a lot of missing data on those questions, because young people just wouldn't really know what to say, or they would skip the question. And in fact, it was fascinating to learn about the ways in which they were identifying, and then also to see how the ways in which they were identifying did map onto their reports of their own personal experiences with ethnic racial discrimination. So that was a very long-winded answer to a great question.
Fascinating answer. So you're going back to Colombia this summer. What do you hope to accomplish?
Well, I'm going back and don't have a lot of time, but more than anything, really going to spend some time with my colleagues there in the university where I initially did my sabbatical. We're returning to these interviews that we conducted with young people. We will be working together to analyze these data so that we can finish a paper that we started way too long ago before the pandemic. Actually, the data that I mentioned and all of the data that I gathered when I was there on my sabbatical was gathered in Medellin. And we will spend some of our time during my visit this summer identifying some other regions in the country where we are going to conduct some similar research so that we can start to explore this idea of context, which we know is so important for how individuals are conceiving their identities, particularly with respect to issues of race, ethnicity, and other identities in which they may experience marginalization.
I guess we'll have to have you back for a second Faculty Voices to follow up.
That would be great.
You've been listening to Adriana Umaña-Taylor. She's the Sara Lawrence-Lightfoot Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thank you for being with us, Adriana.
Thank you so much, June.